So this is the tyranny of the SLA, and of course we want to start with our service level agreement with you, our audience. So let's go through that.
So this presentation will keep you awake 99.5% of the time.
The MTTL will be 4.2 minutes, and if you're curious what the MTTL is, the mean time to laughter.
You agree that as a valued customer, all tweets regarding this presentation must be positive in nature.
And in the case of degraded performance of the presentation, our financial liability is limited to the assessed value of this session, O'Reilly valuation pending, and it's probably going to be on the order of 1/100th of a cent.
And in case of excessive cell phone utilization, your conference access will be revoked.
I mean, here's the thing. Maybe you're hacked, and maybe that's why your utilization's a little high. We want to make sure that, not doing the noisy neighbor thing. So that's what we're making sure. Now, let's step back for a second, and I want to ask you all, how did that make you feel, other than the laughing part? We kind of came in here and we asserted these are the things that, for us to have sort of a relationship together, that you will abide by. You don't even really know if we know anything about SLAs, so that's kind of weird. You're like, well, maybe I agree to like this presentation, even if it maybe sucks. Did that feel kind of weird to agree to that? So I want to do a little survey. How many of you have an SLA for your customers? Okay. How many of you have an internal SLA or internal SLAs between teams? All right. That's a lot of overlap there. That's interesting. How many of you have SLAs with your vendors? Yeah, okay, a lot more people there. And now how many of you don't know whether or not you have SLAs, but have been yelled at as if you had an SLA? All right, yeah. All right, so as John was saying, my name is Paul Reed. I go by J. Paul Reed on Twitter. Sober Build End was the long name, but I actually recently changed it. If you're into podcasts, the Ship Show podcast on Twitter, you can follow us there. My background is build release engineering, and I talk to a lot of people about the DevOps.
And my name is Jim Kimball. I'm the CTO at HedgeServe here in Manhattan. I've been building financial software for about 25 years. I'm at Jim Kimball on Twitter, and I blog at sharinglunch.tumblr.
So, quick thing we wanted to point out that we're going to walk you through a thought experiment about SLAs, and we're going to give you some stuff to take away, but we wanted to sort of deconstruct the SLA because it's one of those things that's very pervasive within our industry. We're all familiar with them, but we wanted to try to figure out sort of why that is and whether or not they're serving us well. So here's some problems with today's SLAs. Now, you probably all have seen this situation where you go to sit down, new software as a service provider, maybe you're signing up for Amazon, and this happens.
Floods, fire, frost of frippery.
Accidents? What kind of accidents?
I didn't know we had to sign anything for this tour.
I can't see what it says in the bottom.
Violet, you first. Sign here. Hold it! Let me through here, you kids. Violet, baby, don't you sign anything there. What's this all about? Standard form of contract. Don't talk to me about contracts, Wonka. I use them myself. They're strictly for suckers.
So we probably all have had that experience. I mean, one of the major problems with SLAs is that we sort of have SLA fatigue. I mean, it's like a wall of SLA. It reminds me of the iTunes EULA. Does anybody really read any of it? Except when there's an outage and then they're like scrambling to find the SLA, and oftentimes it's on the website that's down, so that's kind of weird to try to dig out the paperwork and the email with it. The other problem that we find is like a lot of services may not even have them. It turns out like who uses GitHub? Turns out they don't have an SLA if you ask them, which is pretty interesting. So we get ourselves in this situation where it's like SLA turtles all the way down. If we look at the stack of our application, modern application, it's just SLA turtles all the way down.
So whenever you talk about availability, you hear the 5 nines, right? We have 5 nines, or do you have 5 nines? And so we thought it'd be interesting to go through what does that actually look like. So we'd start with, say, 90% availability. So 10% of the time you can be down. So that would be, of course, 1 9. And you can see that it's over a month, a year, 9 days a quarter, 72 hours a month. And then as you start to add nines, so those numbers get small really fast, right? To the point where when you get down to 4 nines, you can see you're at just under 4.5 minutes of downtime per month. And then the 5 nines, of course, is just under 30 seconds, which, just for a point of reference, right, that's less than the default value for SCSI command on Ubuntu.
SCSI timeout, yeah. You missed one of those. So you might be thinking, well, in fact, in the presentation this morning, we were talking about most internet service providers, they're like trying to pull 2 nines. The electrical grid is only 4 nines. So if you're having trouble with 5 nines, I mean, maybe you want to do 9 5s reliability,
that might be
which gives
easier,
you plenty of downtime. There's the numbers if you need them.
So one of the challenges with SLAs is that definitions are hard. Whenever you start talking contracts, you start talking words, and then you start talking definitions of those words. So in thinking about this, if you have a system failure, but no users are impacted, should that count against your SLA? Or if you have a vendor who has an outage, but it doesn't impact you, do you expect them to count that against their SLA?
This is like if the instance goes down in the cloud and nobody notices
hears it.
Is
yeah.
it
Did it
still
actually
an
go
outage?
down? Yeah. Similarly, you think about EC2. So a service that could have many entry points. If EC2 is up, but the API is unavailable, does that count as an outage for EC2? And with vendors, sometimes a vendor will have a maintenance window, right? So if you've agreed to a maintenance window with a vendor, would you say that that should count against their SLA? Or if you didn't even know that they had maintenance windows, but they did have published maintenance windows, would you think that should count against their SLA? And then there are things like Hurricane Sandy, right? New York Stock Exchange was down for 2 days with Sandy. Do we expect them to count that against an SLA? So trying to cut these in different fine slices, it kind of calls into question, is trying to scrutinize an SLA and a legal contract, is that really a productive thing to do? And part of, in addition to dealing with the words that are used, the concepts can be hard to understand as well, right? So even if you assume best intent of all the parties involved, just the very nature of providing a service makes it hard to get clarity on what an SLA is. And if you step back from a single service and you think about a whole system, right? So there are multiple services that need to all perform successfully to deliver something to an end customer. And your service might be the one that delivers to that end customer. It might be one that's upstream from that. In Release It by Michael Nygaard, he talks about a thing called SLA inversions, where you have a responsibility to deliver a high SLA to your customer, but you rely on services that have a lower SLA. And he goes so far as to look at all of the services and components that make up a system and say that the probability of failure in that system is the combination of the probabilities of all the services and components. I mean, it makes sense, but people don't tend to think of it that way, because then that means in a system with a large number of dependencies, how can you really know your SLA? How can you report an SLA? And when someone does report an SLA, it makes you wonder, like, where did that number come from? Right? What's the meaning behind that?
They just kind of put the smiley face on the opaque box and say, it's fine, just trust me. The other problem with SLAs is they can promote silos. We talk a lot about silos in DevOps, breaking down the silos. In it, they can be used as a way to avoid conversations between teams that really actually need to happen. A lot of times, the silo analogy is kind of weird. Kevin Bear, who's one of the authors of the Phoenix Project, likes to say the silo analogy is a broken analogy anyway, because we often think of it as this, bed and breakfast silo with the little cute tractor, and you can get rides on the tractor, and they'll bring you breakfast. And so we have that notion of it too, but silos are designed for inputs and outputs. Grain goes in, grain comes out. I grew up in Colorado. They actually will explode from time to time if they're not ventilated correctly, because the dust is combustible. So this is not really a good analogy when we talk about silos. This is a much better analogy. This is a nuclear missile silo. Information doesn't go in or out very easily. There's a lot of security around it. The teams that are parts in those silos don't tend to talk to other silos. And in really bad cultures, all the nukes are armed and pointed at the other silos.
So SLAs are being talked about a little bit more now, perhaps, in the past, and people are declaring, for example, the death of the SLA. This is an article in CIO Magazine by Bernard Golden from February of this year, and he makes it very clear how he feels about it. He says that anyone who invests a significant effort in a contractual SLA is wasting your time. Right? And the example that he gives is he talks about negotiating a deal with a cloud provider. And he says that if you're attempting to negotiate an SLA with a cloud provider, you're not going to get anywhere. They're basically going to say they're going to provide best efforts to restore availability, and that's it. Conversely, if you are negotiating an SLA with a small cloud provider, they will sign whatever piece of paper you put in front of them and promise whatever you ask just to get your business. All right? So it doesn't really matter whether you're dealing with large or small. While the actions might appear different, the end result is the same. And Golden goes on to state that the biggest problem here is that the way we're framing the problem, we're taking a problem that is infrastructure and technology and trying to solve it with a legal solution. He says instead that he proposes that we take all the time that we were spending on creating a contract and focus on building resilient technology.
One quick question. How many people have worked for startups where the salespeople come and they're like, hey, I just sold 5 nines reliability to some big company. You're like, that's awesome. Yeah. I see some hands going up of people I know too. But so the point about the move from a defense in depth to resilient systems is really the way the industry is moving. And we see that here. I mean, we're at Velocity building resilient systems at scale is the tag of the conference. I was thinking about this. This is a picture from and a quote from the China Syndrome, which is a movie about a nuclear power plant. If you haven't seen it, it's very good. I'm a Jack Lemmon fan. But, he's explaining this concept of defense in depth to Jane Fonda, and he says, every conceivable thing that has been taken into consideration, that's why we have what we call defense in depth. Now, that means backup systems, 2 backup systems, 2 backup systems. And of course, if you've seen the movie, later in the movie, he's talking about, we stopped the meltdown for one simple reason, and I told you that the system works. That's not the problem. And I kind of like this photo. It's like sad. Jack Lemmon is sad. But he has a realization in the movie, in the plot line of the story, that it turns out that somebody had falsified the records of the nuclear power plant, which is inconceivable to him. But it makes the point that all of us work in complex socio-technical systems. It never occurred to him that there's another person with different values and different pressures that made a different decision that he would have made. Those are the systems that we work in when we're talking about web systems at scale. Mark Burgess, if you know of him, he wrote CF Engine. It's kind of funny. Adam Jacob likes to say he's also of the 3 configuration management providers, Chef Puppet and CF Engine. He's like the best looking of all of them. He has the cool photos. But he's a physicist. He has a PhD in physics, and he released a book about a year ago, a show called In Search of Certainty. And he talks about when you're modeling large-scale infrastructure, whether it be computers, whether it be infrastructure in like electrical infrastructure and that sort of thing, which are actually often one and the same these days. They're controlled by computers. It is much more akin to particle physics, quantum nuclear physics. He actually says that for about a century, determinism was assumed to exist and to be the first requirement to be able to exert precise control of the world, and that idea dominated throughout. Now, what's funny is he says today determinism is known to be fundamentally false. He's talking about in the quantum physics context, and yet we still, especially in the world of computers and information systems, think about certainty, control, determinism. So let's go through a couple of external SLAs. We would be remiss if we didn't bring up Amazon's SLA to take a look at. So of course we went and did that, and what we were surprised to find is first, which SLA? So it turns out that if you go to their site and look for their SLA, you will find a master service level agreement that has definitions in it of service level agreement that points you to 5 other service level agreements, which also those service level agreements have definition of what a service level agreement means. So if you actually wanted to find out, measure all those turtles all the way down and come up with that number, it turns out you're probably going to look at a bunch of different SLAs, a number of different actual documents, and it's even going to depend on, are you using DynamoDB? Are you using RDS? Are you using any of those services? And in what combination are you using them? So that's a problem. Of course, if there is an outage of some sort, you might think you'll get some money back, but you're not going to get money back for account suspensions and terminations. So that sort of makes sense, right? If people are spamming from their instance, you probably don't care. But maybe you've had a situation where your account got terminated because the bill got lost for a couple months. Anybody ever have that happen? All right. Or sometimes maybe they think that you're under your instance has been hacked or something, but you're just doing a particularly excessive load, right? And they may terminate that instance. If that happens, doesn't isn't covered by the SLA. Ditto for maintenance as Amazon defines it.
Maintenance.
Whatever that is, yeah. And also, it ignores the failure of individual instances or volumes not attributable to region unavailability. I don't know about you, but whenever I've had a problem in Amazon, it's been to a number of instances going down. Usually, often a single point of failure that we didn't know. So it was a single individual instance going down. So that's kind of weird. So even if you meet all of this criteria, you're only going to get 10%, maybe 30% if they're having a really bad month, because that number goes up if they have a really bad month. And it doesn't really apply to one-time charges. So if you paid for reserved instances at the beginning of the year, you're not getting any of that money back. Good luck. So a lot of people have asked, well, if you're a really big customer, you might ask, if I'm a really big Amazon customer, do they change? Can I get an SLA? Can I put that into the contract? You might remember there was discussion of it that Amazon had an outage a couple weeks ago, and it was mentioned that Netflix was affected. So I have some friends at Netflix. I was like, hey, buddy, do you have a special SLA? What happened there? And the answer was particularly interesting. I was like, do you have a special SLA with Amazon? And Roy Rappaport answered, he said, well, I can't discuss specifics, but I will tell you, and you can quote me, SLAs are safeguards you put into broken relationships. So you can read into that what you will about whether or not they have an SLA with Amazon, a special SLA. So let's look at PagerDuty. Arup Chakrabarty has a presentation called Who Watches the Watchers? It's about, does PagerDuty use PagerDuty to PagerDuty? The answer, by the way, is yes. But it's fascinating about how they actually use their own service. So I asked them, I went looking like, okay, let's dig out your SLA. So what was interesting is you actually have to email them to get the SLA. And they'll email it back to you. And I thought it was interesting. They said for the basic plan, it's best effort, which we talked about earlier. A lot of times that's the case. For standard plan, it's 5 minutes. Note, though, the answer was it's 5 minutes. I actually don't know what 5 minutes means. It literally said 5 minutes.
I mean, it's clearly better than 10.
Yes,
so, right?
It is better. It's half, it turns out.
So.
And then for the enterprise plan, they actually have insurance, which is kind of an interesting aspect. They have insurance that if you have an outage, due to that PagerDuty would have caught and would have alerted you to, but PagerDuty was down. They actually are backing it up with $3 million, it turns out, worth of insurance. But when you talk to them, and in the email discussion that I had, it turns out that they actually refocus on reliability and resilience. So they talk about how they use different cloud providers. They're not just on Amazon. They actually talk about failure Fridays, where they inject failure. It's kind of like their own chaos monkey, except it's not just a monkey. They actually have teams go and break their infrastructure on purpose. And they found a lot of really interesting things when they've done that. So even in their model, they are shifting the focus from SLAs to resilience and reliability and how they do that. And it actually tells a much richer story, and it turns out it probably results in better business outcomes in terms of time up. So the last one is redacted. It's redacted for reasons that you will soon see. So this provider has a fully redundant network. They have a service level agreement, 100% power and network availability, 24/7 on-site security.
Wait, did you read that?
No. Yeah,
100%. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good SLA.
Yeah.
We actually emailed them and we said, really? 100% SLA availability? That's kind of interesting. And the response was, I forwarded your question to our attorney and he suggested that we remove the reference to 100%. So we will do that ASAP.
So sad.
And it turns out if you go to the website now, they did. So you might ask yourself, like, why do we have SLAs in the first place? And kind of interesting. It goes back to, anybody who was in the data center monkey. I was actually that as an intern one summer. Rack 'em and stack 'em, right? Comes from the telcos. AT&T used to pride itself on 4 nines and 5 nines availability, and so that came into the data center space. And then as we moved to sort of software as a service, we kind of just picked that up because everybody sort of expected that's what you do. What's funny, though, is that in our modern world, it's the kind of this dance that we all kind of just do, and it's, we hope it all works out. It's kind of this thing of, hey, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. There's a document that's going to say everything's going to be all right. And then somehow the lawyers and the business people that maybe aren't technologists are like, well, it's in the document, so we must be fine. We must be covered. Of course, the SLA elephant in the data center, the huge elephant in the room is who owns your availability? You do. In fact, this is a website, whoownsyouravailability.com. And of course, there's a link. If you go there and just hit shift reload, it'll never change from you, but the links it links you to do change. And there's a paper by Velocity's own John Allspaw there. So let's take a look at internal SLAs a little bit. So when we see internal SLAs, and for those of you that have them, you might often find that they can be a bit of a cautionary tale. They can be a bit of a yellow flag when you have them. Because as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of times they are ways to legalize or codify interactions between teams. I've actually seen it as a consultant. It turns out that there was this very onerous SLA internal between two teams, and the only reason it existed is because the manager of this team 6 months ago and the manager of this team 4 months ago couldn't get along, but they'd both left by then. And this SLA was the existing evidence of their hatred for each other, and these teams had to deal with this. So we talked about, well, why don't we just remove that? A lot of times people in organizational design talk about APIs between teams, what we can expect out of other teams. And people might argue, well, SLAs are like an API, but they're a very hard, steadfast, brittle API. If you've ever coded COM, and you had to make sure the implementation had to match the interface, and if there's a mismatch, it all blew up the application, just blew chunks all over your machine. It's kind of like that. It's a very rigid way to sort of establish these APIs. So it's probably not the best way to go about doing it. Of course, language matters when we talk about this. So when we were discussing it and we were doing some research into organizations about SLAs, we found that one organization actually called them service level commitments, because they were wanting to make the point that there's a difference between something that's an agreement, which oftentimes it may not even be agreed upon. It's just sort of, we'll negotiate and horse trade, and then we have this agreement, and you take it back to your team, and you're like, we can't do this. The difference being that a commitment is something that the team decides what they are able to commit to and provide as a service level, and then they advertise that to the organization. And it prompts interesting conversations, like if the business says, hey, we actually want more coverage, then the team can say, well, instead of burning people out, or instead of working people all the time, maybe you need to get us another couple headcount so that we can have the coverage we need. Or maybe we need to open an office overseas somewhere to do coverage that way. Yeah. The other interesting thing is there was discussion around renaming service level agreements as relationship agreements. It's interesting to think about what would happen if we actually just changed the language. I have a relationship agreement with Amazon. I have a relationship agreement with the ops team. The other problem is hidden SLAs, or SLAs that are assumed to be between teams. This is that sort of like, why are you yelling at me? I didn't know that I had a commitment to you. So we have this sort of thing where everybody is sort of agreed because we thought that there was some sort of, again, service level agreement, but it may be unclear. You see this a lot of times when people are onboarded, and that's just part of the culture. It's institutional knowledge, but it's never actually said. So for the first time the person does on-call, somebody yells at them because they're like, well, you said you would reply to this within 5 minutes. And they're like, well, I didn't know that. I know I'm on call, and I answered the pager duty or the Victor Ops ping, and don't know what happened there. So not all SLAs are bad or created equal, though.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about all of the bad things that happens when you have SLAs and how they're always wrong. But if we think about if you've ever been on a team or watched a team that's been dealing with a support issue or an outage, and then another outage happened or another issue comes up, and someone runs up to them and they say, hey, we've got this other outage, and then the team, someone on the team looks up and says, hey, okay, which one should we work on, right? And that's really not a good time to be having that conversation, right? I mean, the person running up to you, is very likely the person who is suffering from the thing that they ran up to you to complain about. And if put on the spot, they'll tell you theirs is more important, right? I mean, that's if there is no external governing factor to help the teams prioritize, then you get into that kind of learned behavior where the people that are raising issues, they know, oh, you got to make it priority one. You got to say that there's a client down because that's how you'll get your problem solved.
If I shout the loudest, I win.
And so the thing is that the service teams, they're not stupid. They realize that's happening, and so they immediately start to like haircut the priorities that people send. They're like, yeah. yeah, I know that one. They always say they're down. They're not down. Don't worry about it, right? So it's kind of this negative feedback loop where there's this little game, and there's no trust between teams. You end up building a culture of no trust. If an SLA can provide that kind of governance, that kind of independent prioritization, then teams can work together productively, and it can reinforce a culture of trust, right? And when we talk about SLAs, I think Paul actually talked before. We try to encourage conversation, and we want the conversation that's like the conversation you have at a lean coffee, not the conversation you have during an outage or during some sort of finger pointing postmortem. And when I think about different practices, I think about things like design studio, value stream mapping, retrospectives, current reality trees. I think about, they all have a goal in mind. They're all done for a purpose. But there's this side effect where they get everybody in a room. A precursor to doing these things is to say, you need to have one person from this group, one person from this group, one person from this group. They get people in a room and they talk. And for me, sometimes that can actually be more valuable than whatever the reason was that you were trying to accomplish in the first place. And so, like, for me, I don't get caught up in, are we doing this particular thing right? If you've got the people in the room and you're talking, then you're already ahead of the game. And if an SLA can do that, then that's a good thing.
There's a very interesting story from Amazon where there was a story of an internal SLA among teams, and it had numbers associated with it, but those were, you might consider them circuit breakers. Once those numbers passed, the only penalty, if you will, is a meeting went on the calendar between those two teams. And it was just a conversation about, hey, we missed it, what went on? And there's actually a story where they were doing database upgrades, and it turns out that the client team and the database team, the database team was having to do upgrades. The client team was like, oh, we'll push some of the heavy work off so you can finish your maintenance window. And there wasn't this sort of, you blew your SLA, so what's wrong with you? So some other considerations for improvement. The idea of aggressive communication, customers, whether they be internal customers, external customers, communication is really important. A lot of SLAs we see actually don't necessarily address how you're going to communicate or what communication is required. It's really important. Some of the things, you can code some of these things into sort of a checklist. So maybe in an SLA context, when you get to a certain point, you might stand up things like the incident command system, which is what the fire service and police departments and other institutions like that use, where they have an incident commander, they have a call bridge open, they do all of those things. A good SLA might speak to that, about when you do that and when that maybe that's not necessary, all that overhead isn't necessary. I wanted to talk a little bit about Brené Brown's research. She's a sociologist at the University of Austin, I believe. And she studies a lot of research. She studies a lot of stuff on apologies and vulnerability and interactions between people in that particular space. She gave a talk on the power of vulnerability. And one of the things she said, that when we are vulnerable and we don't want to be, we're maybe in an environment where vulnerability is really hard, some of the things that we do, or one of the ways that we deal with that, is we numb. Now I want to ask you, how many people have like free unlimited beer in the kitchen, right? I used to be sober build eng, and that was a running joke. It was a reference to the fact that all the release engineering teams I'd ever worked on had a bar, and you could bribe them with certain types of liquor. It's interesting to consider that. We make everything that's uncertain certain. She actually gives the example of religion. It's not about faith anymore. It's about I'm right, you're wrong. And there's a interesting analogy to blameful postmortems. Right? There's just blame. Nobody. It's trying to bring certainty by blaming people.
Some people just call those postmortems.
Yeah. Yes, unfortunately. And then she talks about we perfect. And more dangerously, we perfect our kids. She's talking about, little Sally's going to play tennis by this age, and Bobby's going to play the clarinet by that age, and mapping that out for our children when they're little babies. That's the example she gives in the talk. But it's interesting to think about us projecting this onto employees, that we try to perfect them and say, oh, they'll always respond in a particular way and be successful, even though that may not match the reality of the skill sets on the team or the way the team interacts. So it's interesting to think about, does your SLA help or hurt these particular aspects of things? She closes with a very interesting quote. Whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, or recall, we pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this isn't our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry. We'll fix it. Does your SLA communicate that, whether it's internal or external? Now, some people, I'll go through this really quickly, but some people say, well, I need to have numbers in my SLA, my customers demand it. There's an interesting aspect of sort of weighted minutes that you can sort of incentivize certain things so that certain parts of your SLA, when your organization is doing the right thing, it's getting the call bridge open and doing that, maybe those minutes are weighted less in sort of the penalty phase than some of the full sort of time. It's a way to sort of keep the minutes if people are demanding that, but take the sting off a little bit. But it's important to note it's still sort of a sign of failure. It's kind of like Agile when you're arguing about what done means.
No, I think it's done.
No, it's done.
Done. Thanks.
So this is a modest proposal that we have for looking at and reviewing your own SLAs.
So everybody here familiar with the Agile Manifesto? Right. Yeah, a bunch of guys got together and they came up with just some core values that they wanted to establish as part of the Agile community. And there's 4 kind of main bullets and 3 that I think get the bulk of the work. The one that we want to talk about is the 4th one, and that's customer collaboration over contract negotiation. When this first came out, I originally interpreted it as coding to the spec, right? Someone writes a spec, it's kind of a contract between a business person and a development team. And it gives you the opportunity to say, oh, well, it wasn't in the spec, right? So I don't have to do it. Or it gives the person who created the spec the opportunity to say, well, it's right here in the spec, so you have to do it. But as we've started talking about SLAs and as we think about SLAs, I think that this applies in the same sense, right? That you have a contract versus conversation, and in Golden was talking about that, and he talked about negotiating an SLA as waste. Now some people might need contracts, and that's okay, right? But I think the point here is that the real value comes from the conversation. When we think about the whole value stream, we talked about that a little bit before, and that for a customer only gets value from delivery of the whole value stream. And in Release It, Nygaard talked about how the probability of failure of a value stream is a combination of all the probabilities of the components and the services involved. Goldrat also talked about the weakest link in a chain and local optimization. If you're optimizing a particular service that isn't the weakest link in that chain, then you're not actually adding any value to the end customer. This is Deming.
The god of DevOps.
The god of DevOps. You have to have a picture of Deming. He talked about single supplier, and in this context, I think about it as with a single supplier, a company can work with that supplier to improve the service delivery across the 2 organizations. So it allows you to target the whole value stream. And finally, when we're talking about SLAs as a legal document, going back to the Agile Manifesto piece, it can sometimes discourage cooperation if you're arguing over what you're obliged to deliver and what you're not. That if it discourages cooperation, then that limits your ability to improve, and it kind of shows an example where an SLA can in fact be counterproductive. It can make it harder to improve delivery to a customer.
So what might a complexity-informed approach to an SLA look like? This is the Cynefin model. Who's familiar with the Cynefin model? A few hands go up, right? This is a complexity sense-making framework. We're not going to go through all of it. I actually just did a 4-day training, and I swear every day at the end of the day, my brain was leaking out of my ears on this stuff. It's pretty heady. But it does model the different types of complexity that we encounter within our lives. And so from the path is obvious to complicated to complex and then to chaotic. There's another one we'll talk about shortly. And so really what the model is trying to get you to think about is what are the sort of constraints in a particular system, and that helps you sort of figure out which domain of complexity you're in. And then of course how you would react, what practices you would use when you're in that particular domain of complexity. So when we're talking about things like MTTRs, I promise that I will resolve this issue within 30 minutes. This kind of like 30 minutes or your pizza is free sort of things. That works really well with obvious or simple systems, right? But it turns out that we don't actually do a ton of our work in the obvious space. We tend to do most of it in the complex and complicated space when we're talking about the systems that we operate as web operations people. So here, a component of a good SLA is going to account for crew formation. This idea that if you have a particular problem and it's in the complicated space, you want to get all of those experts together that are going to give you the good practices to solve the problem. And in the complex space, you want to get maybe the experts, but also maybe other people together and swarm and form around the problem to be able to address it. And then, of course, when you talk about the complex and chaotic space, it's really good to have some indication or reference to formalized response. Again, this idea of the incident command system. This idea that we sort of need to act and bring an incident commander in maybe. We need to maybe establish the call bridge, do all of the formalized procedures to really understand what's going on. In the chaotic space, that helps us to actually, you'll note that chaotic space is lack of constraints. That formalization of our response allows us to actually constrain the situation to give us enabling constraints and push the problem up into complex. Now, this kind of weird spot in the middle is disorder. So if you refer to the Cynefin model as a 4-grid model, Dave Snowden, who's a Welshman who came up with this model, will yell at you. He's Welsh, he'll probably yell at you anyway. But he talks about this is actually a 5-domain model, disorders in the middle. And it's the idea that a lot of situations that we show up to, we actually don't know which one it is yet. Right? When we get on the call or we're in the knock, or we call the knock and we do the page or duty page or whatever it is and we get the notification, we may not know, is it a chaotic problem? Is it just a complicated problem? We arrive to this in sort of disorder. And then once we sort of have some heuristics around it, we can figure out which one it is. So that's why detection, your MTDD, mean time to detection numbers, are really important because it turns out you can't really do any of this if you can't detect that there's a problem. I actually worked with a client that there was a problem for 2.5 weeks in their infrastructure and no customer noticed for 2.5 weeks, but then they started noticing. It was kind of interesting. So you need all of these as an aspect of a complexity-informed SLA. It needs to speak to all of these areas. So how might we be able to have an SLA and get the value out of it? So as Paul was just saying, it really needs to cover a breadth of situations. A written document sometimes is hard to get that kind of flexibility. It needs to encourage dialogue and discussion around the delivery of the service as a whole to the end customer. And thinking about how we would know if we have a good SLA. If we see teams talking to each other about the service they deliver, and if we see organizations thinking about how they deliver a service, then that's a sign that our SLA is working for good. And you want it to be as lightweight as possible. If that's as possible. If you have a heavyweight SLA, you're starting somewhere. It's a sign of something to explore. And you can use the things that we've talked about to explore it. So now that we've walked together through this thought experiment with you, these are the kind of 3 big takeaways that we want you to think about if you're looking at your SLAs both with your customers, the ones you send out, the ones you use internally, the ones you may have imposed upon you. So the first is the SLA historically incentivizes the wrong behavior. I think we've shown a number of examples of where it just doesn't get you to do the right thing. It doesn't get your teams to do the right thing in sort of the complex environment that we all find ourselves in. And we all kind of know this. We all know sort of the stance that we do, and we put the paper in the desk until the outage happens, and then we pull it out and start pointing fingers. It just incentivizes the wrong behavior.
And we want SLAs to be complexity informed. We live in a complex world, and simply the notion of writing something down on a piece of paper doesn't necessarily make it true.
And then finally, when you go back to your organizations after Velocity and have a cup of coffee in the morning and start thinking about all the things you've learned, you need to be aware of the SLAs that you're a part of and that are a part of your system when you're trying to figure out, are they serving you well, and maybe how you might change them and how you might address them so that you get more of the outcomes you want and less of the outcomes that none of us want. Thanks.
Thank you. So, of course, at HedgeServe, we're hiring, if you want to take a look at our website.
And also, by the way, it turns out I wrote a little thing for Riley called DevOps in Practice. I actually went by the Pavilion. They have copies of it. If you're interested, it's the story of Nordstrom and Texas.gov and their DevOps journey. So check that out. I think do we have like a couple minutes for questions, or how are we doing on time? Couple questions? We'll do 2 questions. If there are any questions. Yes. Well, quick question. Do you mean internally or with customers? Let's go internally. Okay. I have some thoughts on internal.
Yeah, you can talk about
All right.
internal.
So I would say internally. What? Oh, yeah, sorry. I had that in my notes too. So the question was, we walked through all this. It's kind of weird, but it's good. How do you start these conversations if your team is internally used to just sort of this, I want numbers, I want times, I want whatever. That's really hard. Usually it comes up in the context of sort of organizational change. So it's actually really easy to sort of tack this to the whole, tack this onto the DevOps thing. Hey, we're doing the DevOps, and by the way, DevOps don't have SLAs. You can say I said that, like that's a thing, and we'll see how it goes. But I really liked the Amazon example where it's like, if you have people that demand numbers, fine. Give them numbers, but there is no penalty. The numbers just mean we need to talk. And in that example, that can take you down the road of if you get 2 teams in a room, and it's an SLA that maybe we dropped from 99.5 to 99.4. And that meeting happens, and those 2 teams fight like cats and dogs. Just think if there was an actual outage, right, that affected people, they're going to be doing the same thing. So it's a good place to actually start talking about awesome, blameless postmortems, that whole thing, and start chipping away at that. Because you're right, if there's not that sort of intrinsic trust, it's going to be a problem. The other thing I often find between internal teams, there's at least somebody usually on those teams that like each other, and if you can kind of like amplify what their discussions and in that sort of conversation, that can help too. Does that help?
I mean, and to the point that you were talking about with Kinevin, is it sometimes helping teams to understand their constraints, just as a way to get started, giving the team constraints, it allows them to then explore a space.
One more question, if we have one. Yes? No? No? Going once? Twice? One more? Yep.
Well, I didn't hear the original question, but how do you sell that to a client? The client might say, well, yeah, this is all fine and well, but we require 4 nines on every one of our contracts.
So the question was, how do you sell this to a client? They want the numbers. They want 4 nines reliability.
It depends on how bad you want that client, I mean, if they say they want 4 nines, then you have to figure out what it takes to give them 4 nines, and then basically tell them what that means. For us, when that comes up, that's the start of a conversation, right? What do you actually need, But yeah, if it comes down to it, say no, we can only take contracts with vendors that supply 4 nines, then you can work with your teams and say, do we want to be part of this or not?
And I would add to that, I might change the conversation about what 4 nines means, right? Because a lot of times, like we saw in the PagerDuty example, 5 minutes. 5 minutes of what, right?
Really?
And I don't mean to pick on them, but I think it's kind of funny. So you can handle it that way. But the other thing is, I find that actually we intrinsically understand this. Even users of computer technology understand complexity. You can throw up the Kinevin thing and just say, you're over in complex space. And when that happens, 4 nines is like not a thing. Like the power grid doesn't do 4 nines consistently in some years if there's a big storm over in the Northeast, right? And they will intrinsically understand that, and then it opens it for the conversation of, would you rather have features, or do you want us to put all that money to getting you your 4 nines? And at least they think, well, maybe I want features.
It's a trade-off, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Go and fix your SLAs.